Good day, everyone. My name is Nonkululeko Radebe, and today I'm pretty excited to talk to you about the importance of trying to find a balance between urban growth and rural development. I am a third year PhD student at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany. My talk will cover four subsections, not in consecutive order, but I'll talk a little bit on each of the following. So I'll talk a little bit about the space, so the use of the space in urban areas, the resources, so the use of resources, the quality of life, specifically when it comes to urban sprawl, and I'll talk a little bit about the rural perspectives. Some of the rural perspectives will be covered, I think, by two other speakers, so I won't go into too much details about that. So I'll focus a lot on at least the concept of over urbanization in the African context. So a question that I think is quite important is it feasible to continue investing capital in cities that are already urbanized? And I looked specifically at Johannesburg in South Africa. So Johannesburg is a city found in the Gauteng province, and the Gauteng province is basically the smallest province in the country. The total population of the country as it stands is about 57 million, and 5.7 million people live in the Johannesburg slash Gauteng area. So that's about 10% of the population. Another important statistic is that 23% of the total population of the country is unemployed. So if you look at what 23% of 5.7 million would be, it's around 1 million people in the Johannesburg area that are, well, I would extrapolate also that are unemployed. And this is, I think, quite close to the actual numbers. What drives the urbanization, especially in the Johannesburg area, is migration. And the migration is due to several factors, but most of it being the concept of a better life in a city. So from a rural area, people expect to have more access to education, to water, to healthcare, and subsequently jobs. And in many cases, this is unfortunately not true. And we'll see some of the consequences of this as we continue in the presentation. So here we're just looking at general urban growth. So urban growth, the population of it grows at 2 times the rate of the rural population, at least in the African context. And this is not due to births, it's just due to migration, because people in urban areas are not having as many children as in rural areas. So the population growth is due to migration. And the migration is led mostly by the fact that the rural areas have lower potentials of better livelihoods, at least the perception of lower potential in livelihoods. And if we look at Africa's population, as we know that most Africans are under the age, I think, of 35, which means we have a huge youth population who are looking for jobs, for better prospects, and that's the demographic generally that moves to urban areas, unlike the rest of the world where the population is relatively older than that. So in Africa, we expect that there's a lot more people, at least in the coming years and right now, who'll be moving to urbanized areas. As I mentioned before, there's a perception of employment that you'll find better jobs and so forth. So there's a decrease in the number of employment, at least opportunities or perspectives that are found within agriculture, which are normally in rural areas, and an increase in more service employment by about 26% because people are moving more towards urban areas where these jobs are found. However, we have to be careful that we are experiencing something called like over urbanization, and this is due to spatial planning. So many cities that are found in Africa are not necessarily spaced in such a way to house as many people as there are moving there. Not only house, but provide jobs and other infrastructure that for like transport, schooling, and so forth. The spatial planning was originally not meant for so many people because a lot of it is colonial spatial planning, and in the context of South Africa, it's like apartheid spatial planning. And as I mentioned, the desire of young people to move to these areas is because of jobs and so forth. But what ends up happening is that a large number of people who then do move to these urban areas unfortunately live in more disadvantaged type of settlements due to the type of planning there is and just the lack of opportunities. This is a graph showing top 20 most resource intense cities that are found on the African continent, and it's divided into 5 different materials or material consumption. A large portion of it, at least for the top 5 cities, which are found in Egypt and in South Africa, are mostly in construction. So which means there's a lot of investment going into perhaps infrastructure to grow, and that's obviously an indicator of urbanization and growth. In other countries, it follows a similar trend, but when you go further down, the use of material is more around biomass and fossil fuels, and I suppose this has to do with the types of materials that are found in those countries. It's also important to note that this is not a per capita, but a total city consumption. So the map of per capita looks a little bit different to this. I didn't put it on, but basically many of the East and the West African countries are actually much further down on the map due to slower population growth rate. So generally slightly less people are moving into urban areas. And there's different development priorities and resource efficiency, as well as the access to these materials and resources. So basically what this shows is that there's different priorities depending which African city you find yourself in, and it's quite broad. So it's also important not to umbrella all African cities together and say this is what's happening and these are the types of things or interventions that are needed throughout the continent, because it really differs depending on where you are. So back to Johannesburg and the problem of mass unemployment is that there's also basically an inequality when it comes to access to basic needs, and also access just to things like transport and housing. So what you see here is a train. On the top left hand, you have a train that probably travels the same distance as the train at the bottom, but because it's much cheaper and also just less efficient in terms of how quickly it moves from point A to point B, it has a lot more people on it. So affordability is number one. And if you look on the right hand side, you have a picture that always kind of breaks my heart, because so at the bottom you have this mansion that's found in the suburb of Sandton City, well, Sandton, and it probably houses one family, and it's probably well over 1,000 square meters, with a swimming pool, a garden, basically very lavish. But less than 10 kilometers away from that, you find a slum where I'm pretty sure it's less than 20 square meters of space that houses somewhere between 4 and 6 people. And this is the gross inequality that we see with urban sprawl. So you have all these people moving from the outskirts, moving in, hoping for a better life. And unfortunately, this is the kind of life that they end up living, which is quite unfair and unequal. So as I mentioned, and as we probably all know, that there's a big difference between the types of infrastructure that are found in these two places. And informal settlements lack basically the same things that are lacked in rural areas, so which are services, healthcare, education, and employment. Um, so it's to some degree it's counterintuitive to want to move or to have people moving into a place where the hospital to people ratio ends up being the exact same as if they were still in rural areas. Another important question I think that needs to be addressed is the space democratized? So, is there equal access to free space by everybody? And generally, the answer is no, basically, due to the type of spatial planning there is and just the general inequalities that I've already highlighted. I think this is quite an interesting map to also look at. It's from the World Bank. And it looks at urban population, at least the total urban population that lives in slums. This was back in 2014, so the map is a little bit outdated, but I assume it's still relatively the same in terms of percentage. So if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, it had a population of about 73 million back in 2014, and about 25 million or so of the people were living in slums. And that's about a third of a population that has no access to water, sanitation, living space, and like durable housing. And that's similar to Nigeria and South Africa and many of the other countries that are highlighted. If you look at the ratio between the population then and the number of people, it's always about a third. And this really needs to be addressed, as this is quite bad for growth of a country to have so many people living in slums and not having access to basics. A very interesting concept I found, well, it's not something I work with, but I think there's a speaker later who'll talk in more detail about it, but it's the concept of an urban metabolism. So if you think about your own metabolism, the healthier food you eat, the healthier you are, you grow better, life is just better. And the more junk food you take in, well, we know the consequences of that. So this kind of is a similar concept as a like a human body or any kind of organism. So like a rough explanation of it would be the sum of technical and socio-economic processes that occur within cities, resulting in growth, production of energy, and elimination of waste. And I'd like to focus a little bit on the elimination of waste. So currently, what it looks like in many urbanized areas, and this is specifically in Johannesburg, you have this kind of linear, unsustainable flow of materials where you end up having a lot of water pollution, air pollution, waste pollution. Um, and obviously, this is not only based on the fact that it's this kind of linear flow of materials in, materials out, but also um, more of the psychology of people, how they live. So um, people are more likely to waste and not really take care so much about where the waste goes, I suppose, because that's not necessarily a priority for them, or the spacing within the municipal waste doesn't come as often when there's maybe a lot more houses to get through than in less populated areas. So if a waste management comes once a week to a Sandton versus once a week in an Alexandra, there's a lot more waste for it to pick up, and therefore it doesn't do such a fantastic job as we can see here. And then there's always this very nice concept of saying, okay, we need to look at more circular, more sustainable, equitable ways of using energy and materials, water, and so forth, which will reduce all the types of waste, so the water, the air, and just the general waste. And I think this is it's a good thing to try think about and to want to conceptualize, but the reality is it takes a lot more to change this types of perception than we think. So we, for example, if we're still having countries where plastic, where your groceries can come in a plastic, this is not going to reduce the amount of waste. And if we don't educate people on the life cycle of a specific material, then it's very difficult to reduce the waste. If people have no understanding of the lifespan of a specific type of material, and this comes into the education. So there needs to be education initiatives towards, making a population understand the concept of waste and what this means for the environment and the future of their kids. Um, this is also another result of an unhealthy metabolism. So this is basically socio-economic woes that we experienced or experience quite often. Um, and as I wrote here, that it's not necessarily unique to urban areas, but it's actually it's more often in urban areas because that's where jobs are demanded the most, and services and so forth. And in South Africa, we have quite a lot of service delivery protests, almost one every single month, maybe even twice a month. And in terms of just inequality of life, you then have the haves and have nots. So people who can afford education and others who cannot. And so you end up having protests like, the fees must fall movements. Similarly, you have unsafe spaces, so you have gender-based violence, and those are the types of protests that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years now. And I say all this to say is that whatever the approach is that is being used right now to maintain urban areas or to grow urban areas is not working. It's simply not working. There's no fancy way of putting it, but that's it. We need different approaches. And I hope there's people who are industrial engineers and urban planners and people who actually have an impact in these spaces, who are taking note and are not growing tired. Um, at the same time, because of the current climate uh, issues that we're having, there's a bit of a tug of war between, considering climate and development. And, the irony of this is that many European and North American countries never had this problem when they were going through industrialization and urbanization. They didn't have to quite consider climate, but this is quite a unique problem to Africa, and we need different solutions in terms of how we produce materials. And that's why we need to look more into sustainable solutions that maybe involved already existing materials, at least waste materials such as biomass. Um, Over here, I also just wanted to highlight the need for infrastructure, at least in these urban areas. So 65% of people in the Johannesburg area use taxis, and this is basically what it looks like on the daily, which means there's a need for roads, for example, and then there's the railway and the buses and so forth. But at the same time, there's a need for housing. Um, so better housing structures, maybe more vertical structures like the ones that are found in the central business district of Johannesburg. So a lot of it is more vertical, but the surrounding areas is not as vertical, which is actually quite unique, I think, to African countries because people desire gardens and so forth. So they are not very keen, I suppose, to live in vertical places, but these are things that need to be not only considered but acted upon. At the same time, there's a high demand of energy. We have load shedding every single month in South Africa. So there is a high demand of energy for day to day, like individual consumption, and obviously for manufacturing and many other things. So basically, we have to think about, what kind of interventions can can be used in already urbanized areas or in rural areas. And I think the most important one is to tap into, untapped value chains, and that's using biomass energy and materials in production of energy. So also look a lot more into solar and all types of other energies, because at the moment in South Africa we still use coal as about 70% of our energy, and continuously need to harness more, different types of power. I mean, there's a lot of debates around this, but yeah, I think there's regardless of the debates, it still has to be done. Yeah, so and also other opportunities are maybe looking at creating more satellite cities and decentralizing the resources within these cities. But as I mentioned many times before, the services are overstretched. So to continuously now aid in already overstretched basic services is very counterintuitive in my opinion. And over here we have a very nice example. I think Professor Schmidt will also, Dr. Schmidt will also elaborate a little bit on this. But basically here we look at the interlink between urban growth and development, rural development. So there's many farm products that can be used not only just as food, so many of them do provide food and so forth, but many of them have lots of waste products, and the waste product come in forms of energy, chemicals, and materials, and this can also then enhance urban growth, but it can also create jobs within the rural environment. So it can take away the pressure of the need to move to urbanized areas for a so-called better life. I'm just going to wrap up quite quickly, but I just want to show that the rural employment perspectives, so this is just the total amount of space that is used in terms of employment for agriculture back in 2017. And basically most of the African continent uses more than 60% of its space in agriculture. But interestingly, in South Africa, it's way less than that, so about 10%. But the issue is really because it's a highly monopolized industry and a mechanized industry, unlike the rest of the continent. So there's something to learn from both. But at the same time, there's different challenges when you're trying to tap into these markets in the South African context. Rather, in other countries, I think it might and it will work better. I just want to close off with what actually kids and people desire. So I hosted a summer school back in December, and basically kids, they desire what they know. So they want to be doctors, nurses, and so forth. But basically the need is that they want access to higher education. So they want access to things that are currently very difficult to access if you don't have, the means to do so. But by creating different value chains, you also will encourage them to, have different outlooks on what success maybe looks like and so forth. And I think it's important to always look at children and see what their perspective of life is at the moment. So just covered a couple of key concepts. I'll just skip over that quickly. And these are some of the resources that I used. And I'm open to any questions. I think I might have gone a minute over time, but yeah, thank you for listening. Good day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was both interesting and also very insightful. There are a couple of questions that need you to attend to. So the first one is, how can metabolism be used to improve the conditions of the less privileged? how can metabolism be used to improve the conditions of the less privileged?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So is the question about what initiatives have to happen in order to improve the metabolism of a specific city?
Of the less privileged people?
I think it's an all-encompassing type of answer, because there's education initiatives that are needed in terms of making people understand the impact of the way in which they live. There's the planning. There's the jobs. There's lots of different things that need to be addressed. I think it's not something I can answer in one go, but I think I highlighted quite a few of the initiatives that need to perhaps happen for this. Yeah.
Okay, let's quickly pick another one. You gave the examples of Alexandra and Sante, which are very high extremes in terms of the contrast between the super rich and the poor. How do you think these kind of cities can be more permeable?
So how do I think that the rich cities and the poor cities can kind of be in more harmony? And actually the statement is true. Alexandra and Santon are probably one of the most extremes that you'll find even in the world. And it's quite a challenging thing to do, because you also have to consider that people do want to move to urban areas, and they have a need for jobs and so forth, but the housing structures are completely unequal, and I don't know, it's a difficult thing to just try solve at one go. But yeah, there's a couple of initiatives, but I'm not really sure how to go about it. But yeah.
Okay. To what extent are your recommendations already included in Johannesburg's strategic plan? Yeah, to what extent, did you get that question? To what extent are your recommendations already included in Johannesburg's strategic plans? And what barriers?
I think they are quite a lot. So there's a lot of initiatives, especially when it comes to like recycling and stuff, to try educate people on that. And some areas, for example, plastic is, if you go to a supermarket, you have to buy plastic. So there's that understanding that this is not something that, it's something of value, so you shouldn't just use it and kind of throw it away. So there's education initiatives around specific things like that when it comes to waste and stuff. But yeah, I mean, with Johannesburg, it's mostly just construction, and urban sprawl is happening at a much faster rate than any of the initiatives are actually happening. So I think there are things that some of the recommendations are happening, but at a relatively slower rate than they could actually happen. If you consider the rate at which people are actually moving versus the impact. So yeah.
Okay, let's just quickly add this. Are the barriers due to a lack of effective policy or more from difficulties in implementation?
I think both. Yeah, I think it comes both from a policy perspective and just general barriers when it comes to how quickly things are happening, or at least the exception, the how people accept specific initiatives. And I think earlier we spoke a lot about how certain industries are very rigid and so forth, but that's for most things. So there's a big mentality of how we used to do it, and this is how we know it's done. So the mind shift is quite slow. So it's all, yeah.
Okay. I think we are done with the questions. all the other things we have there are mainly comments. So we just want to thank everyone that has joined us in this session, and especially to our presenters, Dr. Wolfram, Keda, and also to Radebe. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.